Hey, what's up everybody? 8-Bit Flashback here. Today, I will be testing out a retro gaming handheld console called LDK Game, and I'm actually quite surprised by how good some of the emulation is. The LDK is capable of playing a bunch of different systems, including Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Arcade, Game Boy Advance, and much more. Plus, this even plays some PlayStation games. For anyone out there that's interested in the LDK handheld, I did get mine from TomTop.com, and I've got quite a bit of stuff from them over the last couple of years with no issues. And I'll make sure to post a link to this product down below. And here's a look at the LDK handheld. It does run off a Linux Open Dingus operating system. It has a 2.6-inch TFT screen with resolution that's 240 by 320. For a CPU, it uses the JZ4760 chip with speeds around 700 MHz. And it features 16 GB of internal memory with support for external memory up to 128 GB. For the button layout, it's kind of similar to a Super Nintendo controller. It's got the 4 action buttons plus the D-pad and the shoulder buttons on the top. And this D-pad so far has been really impressive. With every game I tested it with, it seems to respond really well. And I'd say the overall construction of this little handheld is pretty decent quality. But I would prefer this handheld to be just a little bit bigger. It does feel pretty small when I'm holding it in my hands. I don't mind the button layout so much, but my hands feel a little bit cramped sometimes when I'm playing. But I know they do offer a landscape version of this as well, but it does cost a little bit more. Inside the battery compartment, you'll find access to the internal memory, which is just on a micro SD card. And I believe there is custom firmware available for this, but I have not messed with that. The only thing I have done is add games to the external memory, which is also a micro SD card. And also included inside the box is a video cable that you can plug into the top of the handheld to hook that to your TV, and a charging cable. And I'm not sure yet the exact playing time you get with this rechargeable battery, but I played it for about 4 hours and I didn't have any issues. And here's a size comparison next to the original Game Boy, just to kind of give you a reference for how small this is. But what's weird here is the D-pads are actually the same exact size. Alright, let's go ahead and power this up and test it out. And there's a couple different apps you can play with on this besides just the emulation. There's a movie player, which I believe you can play MP4s on, but I have not messed with it. There's also a file browser and a few other apps, but I haven't really messed with any of these. Really the only thing I'm interested in is the emulation, so that's what I'm going to concentrate on for this video. There are quite a few different emulators built in and ready to go. The only thing I needed to do was add games to my micro SD card, but I also could have added the games to the internal memory by hooking up the LDK to my computer with a USB cable. It also has a few built-in games, but most of these games are homebrew games or ports of games that have been slightly modified. So there's so many different emulators on here, I'm not going to be able to test all of them, but I'm going to try to cover quite a few of them. So let's go ahead and get started with Game Boy Advance. When you select the emulator you want to play, it will open a file browser where you can search the internal micro SD card or the external micro SD card for the games you want to play. I did test a handful of games for the Game Boy Advance, and out of all the games I tested, I didn't notice any issues. Everything seems to be playing just fine. And something else I would like to add is I did not notice any screen tearing. That's been a huge issue with a lot of these Chinese handhelds, is the screen tearing. So it's great to see no screen tearing and the games playing like they should. With all that being said, I would still not consider any of the emulation on this device perfect, but I would say most of the emulation is acceptable and very playable. And the sound is fairly good too. It sounds clear without much distortion, although it's hard to capture on video because I am recording with a camera and this is not a true capture. Now let's test out some Super Nintendo. This is Spider-Man Arcade's Revenge, and it seems to be playing just fine. Now let's go ahead and let it just play here for just a few. The viewing angles on the screen seem to be pretty nice. I can turn that screen left or right and up and down, and I can still see the screen fairly well, so I'd say the screen is a pretty decent quality. You are able to access the Super Nintendo emulator menu by pushing the side button located right here. Then from here you can save the game because you have those save states, and you can access the settings for the emulator, but I really haven't messed with any of those settings. And most of the emulators that are on this device have their own emulator menu where you can access the save states plus various other settings. But one thing that is kind of annoying is with a lot of the emulators, it's going to be a different button combination. Sometimes you got to push start and select together, sometimes the side button, sometimes you have to push left and right plus start or left and right plus select. So it's different combinations for different emulators. So I wish it was all the same combination, but it's really not that big a deal. Once you get those combinations figured out, it's easy to do. Now I'm testing out the FBA emulator, and this is Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. And it's actually playing really nice. This is an arcade game, and it's playing better than I thought it would. With this FBA emulator, it does support multiple different ROM formats. For instance, I can play Neo Geo games, MAME games, CPS1, CPS2, and a couple other formats. But I have the best luck with games that are formatted to a .FBA format. And here's a MAME game. This is Miss Pac-Man, and I was really disappointed at first because I could not get that screen to rotate. But then I figured out I could just turn the handheld sideways, and it plays just fine. And I did test a bunch of different games out using the FBA emulator, and most of the games had the correct screen orientation, but for some reason Miss Pac-Man was sideways, but that actually ended up working better because I had that full screen effect. And now let's test out a Neo Geo game. This is World Heroes, and it plays pretty good for the most part. I did notice the frames per second drop a little bit at times, but I'd say it's still very playable. Now let's try some Sega Genesis. This is Shinobi 3, and it seems to be playing at full speed, and I'm really not noticing any issues. Now it's time for Nintendo. This is Double Dragon, and I've got a lot of hours playing this game. When I was a kid, I played this all the time, and I remember the game looking better, but it's still fun. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but most of the emulators do support different aspect screen ratios, so you can change it from full screen to the original size, etc. And as you can see here, Nintendo seems to be playing just fine. Now let's try out some PlayStation. And the PlayStation emulation is not so great. There is some games that are playable, but if you want some games that are playable, you need to look for 2D games. Most of your 3D games are going to be playing at a slow speed and not that fun to play. Metal Gear Solid, I would say, is barely playable, but it is pretty choppy because the frames per second is pretty low. So for games like Gex or Rayman, you're going to have a lot better luck, and I think the frames per second will be much more acceptable. But even though the emulation is not that great for PlayStation, I'm still impressed that this little handheld can play PlayStation at all, especially with having a CPU that's really not that powerful. And here's Mortal Kombat 4 for the PlayStation, and I would say this game is not playable. That frames per second is really low, making the game play really slow. But it is kind of cool seeing Sub-Zero freeze people in slow motion. Now let's try some PC Engine. And the emulation for the PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 seems to be good. Everything seems to be running at full speed with decent sound. So here's my overall thoughts with the LDK GAME Handheld. I'm pretty impressed with it. It has pretty decent game emulation. The sound's not so bad. It's got a decent screen. And I like the fact that it's pretty much ready to go. All you have to do is add games to your micro SD card or the internal memory, and you're ready to start playing some games. As far as negatives go, I don't have a whole lot of complaints. I do wish it was just a little bit bigger. I do find the buttons a little bit small. The D-pad's nice, but the rest of the buttons feel pretty small. Okay, it's time for me to get out of here. If you like this video, if you could, hit that like button, and have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.